Chapter 52 of The Evil Genius. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Evil Genius by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 52. L'homme propose, et Dieu dispose. Captain Bennydeck met Catherine and her child at the open door of the room. Mrs. Presty, stopping a few paces behind them, waited in the passage, eager to see what the captain's face might tell her. It told her nothing. But Catherine saw a change in him. There was something in his manner unnaturally passive and subdued. It suggested the idea of a man whose mind had been forced into an effort of self-control, which had exhausted its power, and had allowed the signs of depression and fatigue to find their way to the surface. The captain was quiet. The captain was kind. Neither by word nor look did he warn Catherine that the continuity of their intimacy was in danger of being broken. And yet her spirits sank when they met at the open door. He led her to a chair, and said she had come to him at a time when he especially wished to speak with her. Kitty asked if she might remain with them. He put his hand caressingly on her head. "No, my dear, not now." The child eyed him for a moment, conscious of something which she had never noticed in him before, and puzzled by the discovery. She walked back, cowed and silent, to the door. He followed her and spoke to Mrs. Presty. "Take your grandchild into the garden. We will join you there in a little while. Good-bye for the present, Kitty." Kitty said good-bye mechanically, like a dull child repeating a lesson. Her grandmother led her away in silence. Bennydeck closed the door and seated himself by Catherine. "I thank you for your letter," he said. "If such a thing is possible, it has given me a higher opinion of you than any opinion that I have held yet." She looked at him with a feeling of surprise, so sudden and so overwhelming that she was at a loss how to reply. The last words which she expected to hear from him, when he alluded to her confession, were the words that had just passed his lips. "You have owned to faults that you have committed, and deceptions that you have sanctioned," he went on, "with nothing to gain and everything to lose by telling the truth. Who but a good woman would have done that?" There was a deeper feeling in him than he had ventured to express. It betrayed itself by a momentary trembling in his voice. Catherine drew a little closer to him. "You don't know how you surprise me, how you relieve me," she said warmly, and pressed his hand. In the eagerness of her gratitude, in the gladness that had revived her sinking heart, she failed to feel that the pressure was not returned. "What have I said to surprise you?" he asked. "What anxiety have I relieved without knowing it?" "I was afraid you would despise me." "Why should I despise you?" "Have I not gained your good opinion under false pretences? Have I not allowed you to admire me and to love me, without telling you that there was anything in my past life which I have reason to regret? Even now I can hardly realize that you excuse and forgive me. You, who have read the confession of my worst faults, you, who know the shocking inconsistencies of my character." "Say at once," he answered, "that I know you to be a mortal creature. Is there any human character, even the noblest, that is always consistently good?" "One reads of them sometimes," she suggested, "in books." "Yes," he said, "in the worst books you could possibly read, the only really immoral books written in our time." "Why are they immoral?" for this plain reason, that they deliberately pervert the truth. Claptrap, you innocent creature, to catch foolish readers. When do these consistently good people appear in the life around us, the life that we all see? Never. Are the best mortals that ever lived above the reach of temptation to do ill, and are they always too good to yield to it? How does the Lord's Prayer instruct humanity? It commands us all, without exception, to pray that we may not be led into temptation. You have been led into temptation. In other words, you are a human being. All that a human being could do, you have done. You have repented and confessed. Don't I know how you have suffered and how you have been tried? Why, what a mean Pharisee I should be if I presumed to despise you. She looked at him proudly and gratefully. She lifted her arm as if to thank him by an embrace, and suddenly let it drop again at her side. "Am I tormenting myself without cause?" she said. "Or is there something that looks like sorrow showing itself to me in your face?" "You see the bitterest sorrow that I have felt in all my sad life." "Is it sorrow for me?" "No, sorrow for myself." "Has it come to you through me? Is it my fault?" "It is more your misfortune than your fault." "Then you can feel for me?" "I can and do." He had not yet set her at ease. "I'm afraid your sympathy stops somewhere," she said. "Where does it stop?" For the first time he shrank from directly answering her. "I begin to wish I had followed your example," he owned. "It might have been better for both of us if I had answered your letter in writing." "Tell me plainly," she cried. "Is there something you can't forgive?" "There is something I can't forget." "What is it? Oh, what is it? When my mother told poor little Kitty that her father was dead, are you even more sorry than I am that I allowed it? Are you even more ashamed of me than I am of myself?" "No. I regret that you allowed it, but I understand how you were led into that error. Your husband's infidelity had shaken his hold on your respect for him and your sympathy with him, and so left you without your natural safeguard against Mrs. Presty's sophisticated reasoning and bad example. But for that wrongdoing there is a remedy left. Enlighten your child as you have enlightened me, and then— I have no personal motive for pleading Mr. Herbert Linley's cause after what I have seen of him— and then acknowledge the father's claim on the child." "Do you mean his claim to see her?" "What else can I mean? Yes, let him see her. Do, God help me now when it's too late, do what you ought to have done on that accursed day, which will be the blackest day in my calendar to the end of my life." "What day do you mean?" "The day when you remembered the law of man and forgot the law of God. The day when you broke the marriage tie, the sacred tie, by a divorce." She listened, not conscious now of suspense or fear. She listened with her whole heart in revolt against him. "You are too cruel," she declared. "You can feel for me. You can understand me. You can pardon me in everything else that I have done. But you judge without mercy of the one blameless act of my life since my husband left me, the act that protected a mother in the exercise of her rights. Oh, can it be you? Can it be you?" "It can be," he said, sighing bitterly, "and it is." "What horrible delusion possesses you? Why do you curse the happy day, the blessed day, which saw me safe in the possession of my child?" "For the worst and meanest of reasons," he answered, "a selfish reason. Don't suppose that I have spoken of divorce as one who has had occasion to think of it. I have had no occasion to think of it. I don't think of it even now. I abhor it, because it stands between you and me. I loathe it, I curse it, because it separates us for life." "Separates us for life? How?" "Can you ask me?" "Yes, I do ask you." He looked round him. A society of religious persons had visited the hotel, and had obtained permission to place a copy of the Bible in every room. One of those copies lay on the chimney-piece in Catherine's room. Bennydeck brought it to her, and placed it on the table near which she was sitting. He turned to the New Testament, and opened it at the Gospel of St. Matthew. With his hand on the page, he said, "I have done my best rightly to understand the duties of a Christian. One of those duties, as I interpret them, is to let what I believe show itself in what I do. You have seen enough of me, I hope, to know, though I have not been forward in speaking of it, that I am, to the best of my poor ability, a faithful follower of the teachings of Christ. I dare not set my own interests and my own happiness above his laws. If I suffer in obeying them, as I suffer now, I must still submit. They are the laws of my life." "Is it through me that you suffer?" "It is through you." "Will you tell me how?" He had already found the chapter. His tears dropped on it as he pointed to the verse. "Read," he answered, "what the most compassionate of all teachers has said in the Sermon on the Mount." She read, "Whosoever shall marry her that is divorced committeth adultery." Another innocent woman, in her place, might have pointed to that first part of the verse, which presupposes the infidelity of the divorced wife, and might have asked if those words applied to her. This woman, knowing that she had lost him, knew also what she owed to herself. She rose in silence, and held out her hand in parting. He paused before he took her hand. "Can you forgive me?" he asked. She said, "I can pity you." "Can you look back to the day of your marriage? Can you remember the words which declared the union between you and your husband to be separable only by death? Has he treated you with brutal cruelty?" "Never." "Has he repented of his sin?" "Yes." Ask your own conscience if there is not a worthier life for you and your child than the life that you are leading now. He waited after that appeal to her. The silence remained unbroken. "Do not mistake me," he resumed gently. "I am not thinking of the calamity that has fallen on me in a spirit of selfish despair. I am looking to your future, and I am trying to show you the way which leads to hope. Catherine, have you no word more to say to me?" In faint trembling tones she answered him at last. "You have left me but one word to say. Farewell." He drew her to him gently, and kissed her on the forehead. The agony in his face was more than she could support. She recoiled from it in horror. His last act was devoted to the tranquillity of the one woman whom he had loved. He signed to her to leave him. End of chapter 52.
Chapter 53 of The Evil Genius. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Renate. The Evil Genius by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 53. The largest nature, the longest love. Mrs. Presty waited in the garden to be joined by her daughter and Captain Bennydeck, and waited in vain. It was past her grandchild's bedtime. She decided on returning to the house. "Suppose we look for them in the sitting room," Kitty proposed. "Suppose we wait a moment before we go in," her wise grandmother advised. "If I hear them talking, I shall take you upstairs to bed." "Why?" Mrs. Presty forwarded Kitty with a hint relating to the management of inquisitive children, which might prove useful to her in afterlife. "When you grow up to be a woman, my dear, beware of making the mistake that I have just committed. Never be foolish enough to mention your reasons when a child asks, 'Why?'" "Was that how they treated you, Grandmamma, when you were a child yourself?" "Of course it was." "Why?" They had reached the sitting-room door by this time. Kitty opened it without ceremony and looked in. The room was empty. Having confided her granddaughters to the nursemaid's care, Mrs. Presty knocked at Catherine's bedroom door. "May I come in?" "Come in directly. Where is Kitty?" "Susan is putting her to bed." "Stop it. Kitty mustn't go to bed. No questions. I explain myself when you come back." There was a wildness in her eyes, and a tone of stern command in her voice, which warned her mother to set dignity aside and submit. "I don't ask what has happened," Mrs. Presty resumed on her return. "That letter, that fatal letter to the captain, has justified my worst fears. What in heaven's name are we to do now?" "We are to leave this hotel," was the instant reply. "When?" "Tonight." "Catherine, do you know what time it is?" "Time enough to catch the last train to London. Don't raise objections. If I stay at this place, with associations in every part of it which remind me of that unhappy man, I shall go mad. The shock I have suffered, the misery, the humiliation, I tell you it's more than I can bear. Stay here by yourself if you like. I mean to go." She paced with frantic rapidity up and down the room. Mrs. Presty took the only way by which it was possible to calm her. "Compose yourself, Catherine, and all that you wish shall be done. I settle everything with the landlord, and give the maid her orders. Sit down by the open window. Let the wind blow over you. The railway service from Sydenham to London is a late service. At a few minutes before midnight they were in time for the last train. When they left the station, Catherine has calmed enough to communicate her plans for the future. The nearest hotel to the terminus would offer them accommodation for that night. On the next day they could find some quiet place in the country. No matter where, so long as they were not disturbed. "Give me rest and peace, and my mind will be easier," Catherine said. "Let nobody know where to find me." These conditions were strictly observed, with an exception in favor of Mr. Saracen. While his client's pecuniary affairs were still unsettled, the lawyer had his claim to be taken into her confidence. The next morning found Captain Bennydeck still keeping his room at Sydenham. The state of his mind presented a complete contrast to the state of Catherine's mind. So far from sharing her aversion to the personal associations which were connected with the hotel, he found this one consolation in visiting the scenes which reminded him of the beloved woman whom he had lost. The reason for this was not far to seek. His was the largest nature, and his had been the most devoted love. As usual, his letters were forwarded to him from his place of residence in London. Those addressed in handwritings that he knew were the first that he read. The others he took out with him to that sequestered part of the garden in which he had passed the happiest hours of his life by Catherine's side. He had been thinking of her all the morning. He was thinking of her now. His better judgment protested. His accusing conscience warned him that he was committing not only an act of folly, but, with his religious convictions, an act of sin. And still she held her place in his thoughts. The manager had told him of her sudden departure from the hotel, and he had declared with perfect truth that the place of her destination had not been communicated to him. Asked if she had left no directions relating to her correspondence, he had replied that his instructions were to forward all letters to her lawyer. On the point of inquiring next for the name and address, Bennydeck's sense of duty and sense of shame, roused at last, filled him with a timely contempt for himself. And feeling tempted to write to Catherine, in encouraging fond thoughts of her among scenes which kept her in his memory, he had been false to the very principles to which he had appealed at their farewell interview. She had set him the right example, the example which he has determined to follow in leaving the place. Before he could falter in his resolution, he gave notice of his departure. The one hope for him now was to find a refuge from himself in acts of mercy. Consolation was perhaps waiting for him in his home. His unopened correspondence offered a harmless occupation to his thoughts. In the meanwhile, one after another he read the letters, with an attention constantly wandering and constantly recalled, until he opened the last of them that remained. In a moment more his interest was absorbed. The first sentences in the letter told him that the deserted creature whom he had met in the garden, the stranger to whom he had offered help and consolation in the present and in the future, was no other than the lost girl of whom he had been so long in search, the daughter of Roderick Westerfield, once his dearest and oldest friend. In the pages that followed, the writer confided to him her sad story, leaving it to her father's friend to decide whether she was worthy of the sympathy which he had offered to her, when he thought she was a stranger. This part of her letter was necessarily a repetition of what Bennydeck had read in the confession which Catherine had addressed to him. That generous woman had been guilty of one, and but one, concealment of the truth, in relating the circumstances under which the elopement from Mount Morven had taken place. She had abstained, in justice to the sincerity of Sidney's repentance, from mentioning Sidney's name. Another instance, the captain thought bitterly as he closed the letter, of the virtues which might have made the happiness of my life. But he was bound to remember, and he did remember, that there was now a new interest, tenderly associating itself with his life to come. The one best way of telling Sidney how dear she was to him already, for her father's sake, would be to answer her in person. He hurried away to London by the first train, and drove at once to Randall's place of abode to ask for Sidney's address, wondering what had become of the postscript to his letter, which had given Bennydeck the information of which he was now in search, Randall complied with his friend's request, and then ventured to allude to the report of the captain's marriage engagement. "Am I to congratulate you?" he asked. "Congratulate me on having discovered Roderick Westerfield's daughter?" That reply, and the tone in which it was given, led Randall to ask if the engagement had been prematurely announced. "There is no engagement at all," Bennydeck answered, with a look which suggested that it might be wise not to dwell on the subject. But the discovery was welcome to Randall, for his brother's sake. He ran the risk of consequences, and inquired if Catherine was still to be found at the hotel. The captain answered by a sign in the negative. Randall persisted. "Do you know where she has gone?" "Nobody knows but her lawyer." "In that case," Randall concluded, "I shall get the information that I want." Noticing that Bennydeck looked surprised, he mentioned his motive. "Herbert is pinning to see Kitty," he continued, "and I mean to help him. He has done all that a man could do to atone for the past. As things are, I believe I shall not offend Catherine if I arrange for a meeting between father and child. What do you say?" Bennydeck answered, earnestly and eagerly, "Do it at once." They left the house together, one to go to Sidney's lodgings, the other on his way to Mr. Sarrazin's office. End of chapter 53. Recording by Renata.
Chapter 54 of The Evil Genius. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Evil Genius by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 54. Let bygones be bygones. When the servant at the lodgings announced a visitor, and mentioned his name, Sidney's memory, instead of dwelling on the recollection of the captain's kindness, perversely recalled the last letter she had addressed to him, and reminded her that she stood in the need of indulgence, which even so good a man might hesitate to grant. Bennydeck's first words told the friendless girl that her fears had wronged him. "My dear, how like your father you are! You have his eyes, and his smile. I can't tell you how pleasantly you remind me of my dear old friend." He took her hand, and kissed her as he might have kissed a daughter of his own. "Do you remember me at home, Sidney, when you were a child?" "No, you must have been too young for that." She was deeply touched. In a faint, trembling tones, she said, "I remember your name. My father often spoke of you." A man who feels true sympathy is never in danger of mistaking his way to a woman's heart when that woman has suffered. Bennydeck consoled, interested, charmed Sidney by still speaking of the bygone days at home. "I will remember how fond your father was of you, and what a bright little girl you were," the captain went on. "You have forgotten, I dare say, the old-fashioned sea-songs that he used to be so fond of teaching you. It was the strangest and prettiest contrast to hear your small piping child's voice singing of storms and shipwrecks, and thunder and lightning, and reefing sails in the cold and darkness, without the least idea of what it all meant. Your mother was strict in those days. You never amused her as you used to amuse your father and me. When she caught you searching my pockets for sweetmeats, she accused me of destroying your digestion before you were 5 years old. I went on spoiling it for all that. The last time I saw you, my child, your father was singing the Mariners of England, and you were on his knee trying to sing with him. You must have often wondered why you never saw anything more of me. Did you think I had forgotten you?" "I am quite sure I have never thought that." "You see, I was in the Navy at that time," the captain resumed. "We were ordered away to a foreign station. When I got back to England, miserable news was waiting for me. I heard of your father's death and of that shameful trial. Poor fellow! He was as innocent, Sydney, as you are of the offence which he was accused of committing. The first thing I did was to set enquiries on foot after your mother and her children. It was some consolation to me to feel that I was rich enough to make your lives easy and agreeable to you. I thought money could do anything. A serious mistake, my dear. Money couldn't find the widow and her children. We supposed we were somewhere in London. And there, to my great grief, it ended. From time to time, long afterward, when we thought we had got the clue in our hands, I continued my enquiries, still without success. A poor woman and a little family are easily engulfed in the big city. Years passed, more of them than I like to reckon up, before I heard of you at last by name. The person from whom I got my information told me how you were employed and where. Oh, Captain Bennydeck, who could the person have been? A poor old broken-down actor, Sydney. You were his favourite pupil. Do you remember him? I should be ungrateful indeed if I could forget him. He was the only man in the school who was kind to me. Is the good old man still living? No, he rests at last. I am glad to say I was able to make his last days on earth the happiest days of his life. I wonder, Sydney confessed, how you met with him. There was nothing at all romantic in my first discovery of him. I was reading the police reports in a newspaper. The poor wretch was brought before the magistrate, charged with breaking a window. His one last chance of escaping starvation in the streets was to get sent to the prison. The magistrate questioned him and brought to light a really heart-breaking account of misfortune, embittered by neglect on the part of the people in authority who were bound to help him. He was remanded, so that enquiries might be made. I attended the court on the day when he appeared there again, and heard his statement confirmed. I paid his fine, and contrived to put him in a way of earning a little money. He was very grateful, and came now and then to thank me. In that way I heard how his troubles had begun. He had asked for a small advance on the wretched wages that he received. Can you guess how the schoolmistress answered him? I know but too well how she answered him. Sydney said, I was turned out of the house, too. And I heard of it, the captain replied, from the woman herself. Everything that could distress me she was ready to mention. She told me of your mother's second marriage, of her miserable death, of the poor boy, your brother, missing, and never heard of since. But when I asked where you had gone, she had nothing more to say. She knew nothing, and cared nothing about you. If I had not become acquainted with Mr. Randall Linley, I might never have heard of you again. We will say no more of that, and no more of anything that has happened in the past time. From today, my dear, we begin a new life, and, please God, a happier life. Have you any plans of your own for the future? Perhaps, if I could find help, Sydney said resignedly, I might emigrate. Pride wouldn't stand in my way. No honest employment would be beneath my notice. Besides, if I went to America, I might meet with my brother. My dear child, after the time that has passed, there is no imaginable chance of you meeting with your brother, and you wouldn't know each other again if you did meet. Give up that vain hope and stay here with me. Be useful and be happy in your own country. Useful? Sydney repeated, sadly. Your kind heart, Captain Bennydeck, is deceiving you. To be useful means, I suppose, to help others. Who will accept help from me? I will, for one, the captain answered. You? Yes, you can be of the greatest use to me. You shall hear how. He told her of the founding of his home, and of the good it had done. You are the very person, he resumed, to be the good sister friend I want for my poor girls. You can say for them what they cannot always say to me for themselves. The tears rose in Sydney's eyes. It's hard to see such a prospect as that, she said, and to give it up as soon as it is seen. Why give it up? Because I am not fit for it. You are as good as a father to those lost daughters of yours. If you give them a sister friend, she ought to have set them a good example. Have I done that? Will they listen to a girl who is no better than themselves? Gladly. Your sympathy will find its way to their hearts. because it is animated by something that they can all feel in common, something nearer and dearer to them than a sense of duty. You won't consent, Sydney, for their sakes? Will you do what I ask for you, for my sake?" She looked at him, hardly able to understand, or, as it might have been, perhaps afraid to understand him. He spoke to her more plainly. "I have kept it concealed from you," he continued, "for why should I lay my load of suffering on a friend so young as you are, so cruelly tried already? Let me only say that I am in great distress. If you were with me, my child, I might be better able to bear it." He held out his hand. Even a happy woman could hardly have found it in her heart to resist him. In silent sympathy and respect, Sydney kissed the hand that he had offered to her. It was the one way in which she could trust herself to answer him. Still encouraging her to see new hopes and new interests in the future, the good captain spoke of the share which she might take in the management of the home, if she would like to be his secretary. With this view he showed her some of the written reports relating to the institution, which had been sent to him during the time of his residence at Sydenham. She read them with an interest and attention which amply justified his confidence in her capacity. These reports, he explained to her, are kept of reference, but as a means of saving time. The substance of them is entered in the daily journal of our proceedings. Come, Sydney, venture on a first experiment in your new character. I see pen, ink, and paper on the table. Try if you can shorten one of the reports, without leaving out anything which is important to know. For instance, the writer gives reasons for making his statement. Very well expressed, no doubt, but we don't want reasons. Then, again, he offers his own opinion on the right course to take. Very creditable to him, but I don't want his opinion, I want his facts. Take the pen, my secretary, and set down his facts. Never mind his reflections." Proud and pleased, Sydney obeyed him. She made a little abstract, and was reading it to him at his request, while he compared it with the report, when they were interrupted by a visitor. Randall Linley came in, and noticed the papers on the table with a surprise. "Is it possible that I am interrupting business?" he asked. Bennydeck answered with an assumed air of importance which was in itself a compliment to Sydney. "You find me engaged on the business of the house with my new secretary." Randall at once understood what had happened. He took his friend's arm and led him to the other end of the room. "You good fellow," he said, "add to your kindness my excusing me if I ask for a word with you in private." Sydney rose to retire. After having encouraged her by a word of praise, the captain proposed that she should get ready to go out, and should accompany him on a visit to the home. He opened the door for her as respectfully as if the poor girl had been one of the highest ladies in the land. "I have seen my friend Sarrazin," Randall began, "and I have persuaded him to trust me with Catherine's present address. I can send Herbert there immediately, if you will only help me." "How can I help you?" "Will you allow me to tell my brother that your engagement is broken off?" Bennydeck shrank from the painful allusion, and showed it. Randall explained. "I am grieved," he said, "to distress you by referring to this subject again. But if my brother is left under the false impression that your engagement will be followed by your marriage, he will refuse to intrude himself on the lady who was once his wife." The captain understood. "Say what you please about me," he replied. "Unite the father and the child, and you may reconcile the husband and wife." "Have you forgotten," Randall asked, "that the marriage has been dissolved?" Bennydeck's answer ignored the law. "I remember," he said, "that the marriage has been profaned." End of chapter 54. Read by Lambda.
Chapter 65 of The Evil Genius. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tech Savvy. The Evil Genius by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 65. Leave it to the child. The front windows of Brightwater Cottage look out on a quiet green lane in Middlesex, which joins the high road within a few miles of the market town of Uxbridge. Through the pretty garden at the back runs a little brook, winding its merry way to a distant river. The few rooms in this pleasant place of residence are well furnished, having regard to the limits of a building which is a cottage in the strictest sense of the word. Water-colour drawings by the old English masters of the art ornament the dining room. The parlour has been transformed into a library. From floor to ceiling all four of its walls are covered with books. Their old and well-chosen buildings, seen in the mass, present nothing less than a feast of colour to the eye. The library and the works of art are described as heirlooms, which have passed into the possession of the present proprietor, one more among the hundreds of Englishmen who are ruined every year by betting on the turf. So sorely in need of a little ready money was this victim of gambling, tacitly permitted or conveniently ignored by the audacious hypocrisy of a country which rejoiced in the extinction of Baden, and which still shudders at the name of Monaco, that he was ready to let his pretty cottage for no longer a term than 1 month certain, and he even allowed the elderly lady who drove the hardest part of hard bargains with him to lessen by 1 guinea the house rent paid for each week. He took his revenge by means of an ironical compliment, addressed to Mrs. Presty. "What a saving it would be to the country, ma'am, if you were Chancellor of the Exchequer." With perfect gravity Mrs. Presty accepted that well-earned tribute of praise. "You're quite right, sir. I should be the first official person known to the history of England who took proper care of the public money." Within 2 days of the time when they had left the hotel at Sydenham, Catherine and her little family circle had taken possession of the cottage. The two ladies were sitting in the library, each occupied with a book chosen from the well-stocked shelves. Catherine's reading appeared to be more than once interrupted by Catherine's thoughts. Noticing this circumstance, Mrs. Presty asked if some remarkable event had happened, and if it was weighing heavily on her daughter's mind. Catherine answered that she was thinking of Kitty, and that anxiety connected with the child did weigh heavily on her mind. Some days had passed since the interview at which Herbert Linley had bidden her farewell. On that occasion he had referred to her proposed marriage in terms of forbearance and generosity which claimed her sincerest admiration. It might be possible for her to show a grateful appreciation of his conduct. Devotedly fond of his little daughter, he must have felt acutely his long separation from her, and it was quite likely that he might ask to see Kitty. But there was an obstacle in the way of her willing compliance with that request, which it was impossible to think of without remorse, and which it was imperatively necessary to remove. Mrs. Presty would understand that she alluded to the shameful falsehood which had led the child to suppose that her father was dead. Strongly disapproving of the language in which her daughter had done justice to the conduct of the divorced husband, Mrs. Presty merely replied, "You are Kitty's mother. I leave it to you," and returned to her reading. Catherine could not feel that she had deserved such an answer as this. "Did I plan the deception?" she asked. "Did I tell the lie?" Mrs. Presty was not in the least offended. "You are comparatively innocent, my dear," she admitted, with an air of satirical indulgence. "You only consented to the deception, and profited by the lie. Suppose we own the truth. You are afraid." Catherine owned the truth in the plainest terms. "Yes, I am afraid." "And you leave it to me?" "I leave it to you." Mrs. Presty complacently closed her book. "I was quite prepared to hear it," she said. "All the unpleasant complications since your divorce, and heaven only knows how many of them have presented themselves, have been left for me to unravel. It so happens, though I was too modest to mention it prematurely, that I have unravelled this complication. If one only has eyes to see it, there is a way out of every difficulty that can possibly happen." She pushed the book that she had been reading across the table to Catherine. "Turn to page 240, she said. "There is a way out." The title of the book was Disasters at Sea, and the page contained the narrative of a shipwreck. On evidence apparently irresistible, the drowning of every soul on board the lost vessel had been taken for granted, when a remnant of the passengers and the crew had been discovered on a desert island, and had been safely restored to their friends. Having read this record of suffering and suspense, Catherine looked at her mother and waited for an explanation. "Don't you see it?" Mrs. Presty asked. "I can't say that I do." The old lady's excellent temper was not in the least ruffled even by this. "Quite inexcusable on my part," she acknowledged. "I ought to have remembered that you didn't inherit your mother's vivid imagination. Age has left me in full possession of those powers of invention which used to amaze your poor father. He wondered how it was that I never wrote a novel. Mr. Presty's appreciation of my intellect was equally sincere, but he took a different view. "Beware, my dear," he said, "of trifling with the distinction which you now enjoy. You're one of the most remarkable women in England. You've never written a novel. Pardon me, I'm wandering into the region of literacy anecdote, when I ought to explain myself. Now pray attend to this. I propose to tell Kitty that I have found a book which is sure to interest her, and I shall direct her attention to the lamentable story which you have just read. She is quite sharp enough to ask if the friends of the poor shipwrecked people were not very much surprised to see them again. To this I shall answer, very much, indeed, for their friends thought they were dead. Ah, you dear dull child, you see it now." Catherine saw it so plainly that she was eager to put the first part of the experiment to an immediate trial. Kitty was sent for, and made her appearance with a fishing rod over her shoulder. "I'm going to the brook," she announced. "Expect some fish for dinner to-day." A very old hand stopped Catherine in the act of presenting Disasters at Sea to Kitty's notice, and a voice distinguished by insinuating kindness said to the child, "When you have done fishing, my dear, come to me. I've got a nice book for you to read." "How very absurd of you, Catherine," Mrs. Presty continued, when they were alone again, "to expect the child to read. If there is any fish in the brook, she won't catch 'em. When she comes back disappointed and says, 'What am I to do now?' the disasters at sea will have a chance. I make it a rule never to boast, but if there is a thing that I understand, it's the management of children. Why didn't I have a large family?" Attended by the faithful Susan, Kitty baited her hook, and began to fish where the waters of the brook were overshadowed by trees. A little arbour, covered by a thatched roof, and having walls of wooden lattice work, hidden by creepers climbing over them inside and out, offered an attractive place of rest on this sheltered side of the garden. Having brought her work with her, the nursemaid retired to the summer house, and diligently plied her needle, looking at Kitty from time to time through the open door. The air was delightfully cool. The pleasant rippling of the brook fell soothingly on the ear. The seat in the summer house received a sitter with the softly yielded submission of elastic wires. Susan had just finished her early dinner, in mind and body alike. This good girl was entirely and deservedly at her ease. By finally succeeding degrees, her eyelids began to show a tendency downward. Her truant needlework escaped from her fingers, and lay lazily on her lap. She snatched it up with a start, and sewed it with severe resolution until her thread was exhausted. The reel was ready at her side. She took it up for fresh supply, and innocently rested her head against the leafy and flowery wall of the arbour. Was it thought that gradually closed her eyes again, or was it sleep? In either case, Susan was lost to all sense of passing events, and Susan's breathing became musically regular, emulous of the musical regularity of the brook. As a lesson in patience, the art of angling pursued in a shallow brook has its moral uses. Kitty fished, and waited, and renewed the bait, and tried again, with a command of temper which would have been a novelty in Susan's experience, if Susan had been awake. But the end which comes to all things came also to Kitty's patience. Leaving her rod on the bank, she set the line and hook take care of themselves, and wandered away in search of some new amusement. Lingering here and there to gather flowers from the beds as she passed them, Kitty was stopped by a shrubbery with a rustic seat placed near it, which marked the limits of the garden on that side. The path that she had been following led her further and further away from the brook, but she still left it well in view. She could see on her right hand the clumsy old wooden bridge which crossed the stream, and served as a means of communication for the servants and the tradespeople, between the cottage and the village on the lower ground a mile away. The child felt hot and tired. She rested herself on the bench, and spreading the flowers by her side, began to arrange them in the form of a nosegay. Still true to her love for Sidney, she had planned to present the nosegay to her mother, offering the gift as an excuse for returning to the forbidden subject of her governess, and for asking when they might hope to see each other again. Choosing flowers and then rejecting them, trying other colours and wondering whether she had accomplished a change for the better, Kitty was startled by the sound of a voice calling to her from the direction of the brook. She looked around and saw a gentleman crossing the bridge. He asked the way to Brightwater Cottage. There was something in his voice that attracted her. How or why, at her age, she never thought of inquiring. Eager and excited, she ran across the lawn, which lay between her and the brook, before she answered the gentleman's question. As they approached each other, his eyes sparkled, his face flushed. He cried out joyfully, "Here she is!" and then changed again in an instant. A horrid pallor overspread his face as the child stood looking at him with innocent curiosity. He startled Kitty, not because he seemed to be shocked and distressed, she hardly noticed that, but because he was so like, although he was thinner and paler and older, oh, so like her lost father. "This is the cottage, sir," she said faintly. His sorrowful eyes rested kindly on her, and yet it seemed as if she had in some way disappointed him. The child ventured to say, "Do you know me, sir?" He answered in the saddest voice that Kitty had ever heard, "My little girl, what makes you think I know you?" She was at a loss how to reply, fearing to distress him. She could only say, "So like my poor papa." He shook and shuddered, as if she had said something to frighten him. He took her hand. On that hot day his fingers felt as cold as if it had been winter time. He led her back to the seat that she had left. "I'm tired, my dear," he said. "Shall we sit down?" It was surely true that he was tired. He seemed hardly able to lift one foot after the other. Kitty pitied him. "I think you must be ill," she said, as they took their places side by side on the bench. "No, not ill, only very, and perhaps a little afraid of frightening you." He kept her hand in his hand, and patted it from time to time. "My dear, why did you say 'poor papa' when you spoke of your father just now?" "My father is dead, sir." He turned his face away from her, and pressed both hands on his breast, as if he had felt some dreadful pain there, and was trying to hide it. But he mastered the pain, and he said a strange thing to her, very gently, but still it was strange. He wished to know who had told her that her father was dead. "Grandmamma told me." "Do you remember what grandmamma said?" "Yes, she told me papa was drowned at sea." He said something to himself, and said it twice over. Not her mother! Thank God, not her mother! What did he mean? Kitty looked and looked at him, and wondered and wondered. He put his arm around her. "Come near me," he said. "Don't be afraid of me, my dear." She moved nearer and showed him that she was not afraid. The poor man seemed hardly to understand her. His eyes grew dim. He sighed like a person in distress. He said, "Your father would have kissed you, little one, if he had been alive. You say I'm like your father. May I kiss you?" She put her hands on his shoulders and lifted her face to him. In the instant when he kissed her, the child knew him. Her heart beat suddenly with an overpowering delight. She started back from his embrace. "That's how Papa used to kiss me," she cried. "Oh, your Papa, not drowned, not drowned!" She flung her arms around his neck and held him as if she would never let him go again. "Dear Papa, poor lost Papa!" His tears fell on her face. He sobbed over her. "My sweet darling, my own little Kitty." The hysterical passion that had overcome her father filled her with piteous surprise. How strange, how dreadful, that he should cry, that he should be so sorry when she was so glad. She took a little handkerchief out of the pocket of her pinafore and dried his eyes. "Are you thinking of the cruel sea, Papa?" "No, the good sea, the kind, bright, beautiful sea that has given you back to me and to Mamma." They had forgotten her mother, and Kitty only discovered it now. She caught at one of her father's hands, hanging helpless at his side, and pulled as if with little strength could force him to his feet. "Come," she cried, "and make Mamma as happy as I am." He hesitated. She sprang on his knee. She pressed her cheek against his cheek with the caressing tenderness, familiar to him in the first happy days when she was an infant. "Oh, Papa, are you going to be unkind to me for the first time in your life?" His momentary resistance was at an end. He was as weak in her hands now as if he had been the child and she had been the man. Laughing and singing and dancing round him, Kitty led the way to the window of the room that opened on the garden. Someone had closed it on the inner side. She tapped impatiently at the glass. Her mother heard the tapping. Her mother came to the window. Her mother ran out to meet them. Since the miserable time when they left Mount Morven, since the long unnatural separation of the parents and the child, those three were together once more. End of Leave It to the Child. Recording by TechSavvy. www.techsavvy.wordpress.com. End of The Evil Genius by Wilkie Collins.